My husband has been sending money to someone for 18 years, and I just found out it's going to a child I never knew existed. I found the bank statements in the drawer where David keeps our tax documents. I wasn't snooping, just looking for last year's mortgage interest forms because our accountant had requested them. The statements were from an account I'd never seen before, a checking account in David's name only, opened in 2006. Every month for the past 18 years, $800 had been transferred out with the memo line reading monthly support. My hands started shaking as I flipped through page after page, watching $800 disappear on the 15th of every month like clockwork. That was $172,800 over 18 years, money I never knew existed, going to someone I'd never heard of. We'd been married for 22 years. We had 2 daughters, Claire, who was 19 and studying at college, and Nina, who was 16 and still at home. We lived in a comfortable house in suburban Connecticut, both worked demanding jobs, and managed our finances together. Or so I thought. I sat on the floor of David's home office with statements spread around me and tried to understand what I was seeing. The account received deposits from David's paycheck, smaller amounts than what went into our joint account, but substantial enough that I should have noticed the discrepancy in his take-home pay, except I'd never scrutinized his pay stubs, because I trusted him completely. We'd built a life together based on honesty and partnership, or at least that's what I'd believed until 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon when everything I thought I knew shattered. David came home at 6:30, called out his usual greeting, and found me still sitting on the office floor surrounded by evidence of his secret life. His face went pale when he saw the statements in my hands. He didn't ask what I was doing or get defensive. He just stood in the doorway with his briefcase still in his hand and said, "I can explain." Those 3 words made everything worse because they confirmed this wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. This was deliberate, sustained, and he'd been hiding it from me for nearly 2 decades. I asked him to sit down and explain everything, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. David set his briefcase down and lowered himself into the desk chair across from me. He asked where I wanted him to start, and I said the beginning, all of it, no lies or omissions. He took a breath and told me about Vanessa, a woman he'd dated briefly before we met. They'd been together for about 6 months in 2005, broke up amicably, and he hadn't thought much about it afterward. Then in March 2006, Vanessa contacted him. She was 5 months pregnant, and the baby was his. David said they'd used protection, but obviously it had failed. Vanessa didn't want to be in a relationship with him, but she thought he deserved to know he was going to be a father. She planned to raise the child as a single mother and wasn't asking for anything from him, just giving him the information. David said he'd been terrified when Vanessa told him. We'd only been married for 4 years at that point. Claire was 2 years old, and we were stable and happy. He didn't know how to tell me he'd gotten another woman pregnant just before we met, that there would be a child out there who was his biological son or daughter. He said he spent weeks trying to figure out what to do, how to break the news to me, what the right thing was. Then he made a decision that would define the next 18 years. He told Vanessa he wanted to support the child financially, even though she hadn't asked for it. He opened a separate bank account, arranged for automatic transfers, and committed to sending $800 monthly. Vanessa accepted the arrangement because raising a child alone was expensive, and she appreciated David's willingness to help even though they weren't together. The baby was born in July 2006, a boy named Ethan. David said he'd met Ethan twice, once right after he was born, and once when he was 3. Both meetings had been brief and coordinated through Vanessa. After that second meeting, Vanessa said she thought it was better if David was supportive, but not actively involved in Ethan's life. She didn't want to confuse the child or create complications. Seemed easier than figuring out how to integrate this secret son into our family. I sat there listening to my husband describe an entire human being he'd helped create and had been supporting for 18 years without ever telling me. The betrayal felt physical, pressing against my chest until I couldn't breathe properly. I asked why he never told me, why he let me believe for 22 years that we didn't have secrets between us. David said he'd been planning to tell me in the beginning, but the timing was never right. Then Claire was born, and we were overwhelmed with a toddler and a newborn. Then years passed and the secret got bigger and harder to confess. He said he'd convinced himself that since he wasn't actively involved in Ethan's life, it wasn't really a lie. The money went out automatically and he tried not to think about it, tried to compartmentalize this part of his life away from our marriage. He knew it was wrong, he said, but the longer he waited, the more impossible it seemed to tell the truth. I asked about the money, the nearly $173,000 he'd sent over 18 years. That was money that could have gone toward our daughter's college funds, toward our retirement, toward the life we were building together. David said he'd always made sure our family was taken care of first, that the money he sent to Vanessa came from extra income and side projects, but I could see the guilt in his face. He knew that money represented more than dollars. It represented a commitment he'd made to another child while hiding that child's existence from me. I told David I needed him to leave the house. I couldn't be in the same space with him while I processed this. He nodded and started to say something about loving me, but I cut him off. Love wasn't the issue. Trust was the issue. Honesty was the issue. He'd built our entire marriage on a foundation of deception, and I didn't know how to reconcile the man I thought I'd married with the one sitting in front of me. David packed a bag and left for a hotel. After he drove away, I sat in our bedroom and cried until my head throbbed. Then I got angry. Not just at David for lying, but at myself for never noticing. How had I not seen the missing money? How had I not questioned anything over 18 years? The next morning, Nina found me still in yesterday's clothes, sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee. She asked if I was sick, and I told her Dad and I were having problems, that he was staying somewhere else for a few days. She pressed for details, but I couldn't explain it yet. How do you tell your 16-year-old daughter she has an 18-year-old brother she never knew existed? I called my sister Amanda because I needed to tell someone before I exploded. She listened to everything without interrupting, then said something that made me feel both validated and worse. She said David had stolen 18 years of honesty from me, that this wasn't just about a child from before our marriage, it was about choosing to lie every single day for nearly 2 decades. Amanda asked if I'd contacted Vanessa, or tried to find out more about Ethan. I hadn't even thought about that yet. My focus had been entirely on David's betrayal, not on the actual child who existed because of it. But Amanda was right that Ethan was a real person, probably 18 years old now, a recent high school graduate, someone who was biologically connected to my daughters whether any of us had known it or not. I spent that afternoon searching for Vanessa online. It wasn't hard to find her. She had a public social media profile with photos going back years. There was Ethan at various ages, a boy who looked startlingly like David. Same dark hair, same build, same smile. The resemblance was so obvious I couldn't understand how David had kept this secret. If anyone who knew our family had seen a picture of Ethan, they would have immediately recognized the similarity to David and our daughters. Vanessa's profile showed a normal life, a single mother raising her son, posting about his accomplishments and milestones. Soccer games, school awards, family vacations. Ethan had graduated high school in June just 2 months ago. There were photos of him in a cap and gown, Vanessa beaming beside him. I scrolled through years of a life that had been running parallel to ours, funded partly by my husband's secret account, and felt a complicated mix of emotions I couldn't name. I called David that evening and told him I'd found Vanessa online, that I'd seen pictures of Ethan. There was a long silence before David asked what I thought. I told him I thought Ethan looked exactly like him, that anyone with eyes could see the resemblance, that I didn't understand how he'd maintained this lie when the evidence was so visible. David said Vanessa had kept her social media relatively private until recently, that she'd only made it public in the past year or so when Ethan turned 18 and was old enough to handle questions about his father. He said Vanessa had been careful about protecting Ethan's privacy and their family situation, that she'd never pushed David to be more involved or threatened to expose him. She'd kept their agreement and let David maintain his separate life. I asked if David had seen the graduation photos, if he'd felt anything knowing his son had reached this milestone without him. David's voice broke when he said yes, he'd seen them, that Vanessa had sent him a private message with a few pictures. He said it hurt more than he expected, seeing Ethan grown up, realizing how much time had passed and how much he'd missed. But he'd made his choice 18 years ago to be financially present but otherwise absent, and he had to live with that. I told David I wanted to meet Vanessa and Ethan. If this child was connected to our family, I needed to understand the full situation, not just David's sanitized version of it. David hesitated, said he didn't think that was a good idea, that it might complicate things unnecessarily. I told him things were already complicated, that he didn't get to control the narrative anymore. He'd lost that right when he'd spent 18 years lying to me. After a pause, David said he'd reach out to Vanessa and ask if she'd be willing to meet with us. 2 days later, Vanessa agreed to meet me, just the two of us without David present. She suggested a coffee shop in Hartford, neutral territory between our respective towns. I drove there on a Saturday morning feeling sick with nerves. Vanessa was already seated when I arrived, a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and an obvious wariness. She stood when I approached, and we shook hands awkwardly. We sat down with our coffee, and for a moment, neither of us knew how to start. Finally, Vanessa said she was sorry I'd found out this way, that she'd always assumed David would tell me eventually. She'd thought in the early years that he'd come clean, and as time passed, she'd convinced herself it wasn't her place to interfere in his marriage. She'd accepted his financial support and kept their arrangement private because it seemed like what David wanted. I asked Vanessa to tell me about Ethan, to help me understand who this person was. She pulled out her phone and showed me photos, talking about her son with obvious love and pride. Ethan was smart and kind, she said, planning to study engineering at State University. He played soccer, worked part-time at a restaurant, and had a good group of friends. He knew David was his biological father, knew about the financial support, and knew David had chosen not to be actively involved in his life. Vanessa said Ethan had been hurt by that when he was younger, had asked questions about why his dad didn't want to know him. She'd explained as best she could that David had another family, that the situation was complicated, that it wasn't about Ethan not being worthy of love. Over time, Ethan had accepted it, built a life that didn't include David, and stopped asking questions. Vanessa said Ethan was curious about his half-sisters, though. He'd known for years that he had 2 sisters, had seen photos Vanessa had found online, and wondered what they were like. I felt tears starting and fought them back. This boy had known about Claire and Nina, while they'd known nothing about him. The information asymmetry felt cruel, like we'd been living in ignorance while Ethan had been aware of us the whole time. I asked Vanessa if she'd be willing to introduce me to Ethan, if he'd want to meet me. She said she'd ask him, that ultimately it was his decision. She warned me that he might not be interested, that he'd built walls around the topic of David and might not want to open that door. I understood, but I told her I needed to try. I needed to see this person who shared DNA with my daughters, who existed because of my husband's choices, who'd been hidden from me for nearly 2 decades. Vanessa promised to talk to Ethan and let me know. We parted with an awkward hug, and I drove home feeling overwhelmed by everything I'd learned. That evening, I told Claire and Nina everything. They deserved to know they had a brother, that their father had kept this enormous secret. Claire's reaction was shock and then hurt. She asked how Dad could have lied for so long, how he could have let us believe we knew everything about our family. Nina was quieter, processing the information without much visible reaction. Then she asked if we could meet Ethan, if he wanted to meet us. I said I'd asked Vanessa the same thing, and we were waiting to hear. The next few days were tense as we waited for Vanessa's response. David stayed at the hotel, called every day to check on us, and asked if I'd made any decisions about our marriage. I told him I didn't know yet, that I needed to meet Ethan first, needed to understand the full scope of what he'd hidden. Vanessa called 5 days after our coffee meeting. She said Ethan had agreed to meet me and the girls if we wanted, that he was nervous but curious. We arranged to meet at a park in Vanessa's town the following Saturday. David asked if he should come, and I said no. This meeting was for us to meet Ethan, not for David to play happy family after 18 years of absence. Claire, Nina, and I drove to the park together. Nobody talked much during the 40-minute drive. When we arrived, Vanessa and Ethan were waiting at a picnic table. Ethan stood when he saw us approaching, and I got my first in-person look at my husband's secret son. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with David's dark hair and sharp features. But he had Vanessa's eyes and her gentle demeanor. He looked nervous, his hands shoved in his pockets, but he managed a small smile as we got closer. I introduced myself and the girls, and Ethan shook each of our hands. We sat down at the table, and the awkwardness was thick. Vanessa had brought drinks and snacks, clearly trying to make this feel casual, but there was nothing casual about 3 girls meeting their secret brother for the first time. Claire broke the silence by asking Ethan about college, and he relaxed a bit as he talked about his plans to study mechanical engineering. Nina asked about soccer, and they discovered they both played, which gave them common ground. I watched my daughters interact with this young man who was their brother, saw them finding similarities and connections, and felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride that they were handling this so maturely, sadness that they'd missed 18 years of knowing each other, anger at David for creating this situation. After about an hour, the conversation had become more natural. Ethan had a good sense of humor and was clearly intelligent. He asked careful questions about our family, about what his sisters were interested in, about our lives. Never once did he ask about David, and I appreciated that restraint. When it was time to leave, Claire asked if they could exchange numbers, if they could stay in touch. Ethan looked at Vanessa, who nodded, and they swapped contact information. Nina did the same. As we were walking back to our cars, Ethan called out to me. I turned and he said thank you for being willing to meet him, that it meant something even though the situation was complicated. I told him he was welcome in our lives if he wanted to be, that whatever happened between David and me, Ethan was connected to my daughters, and that mattered. On the drive home, Claire and Nina were quiet at first, then started talking about how weird it was to have a brother they'd never known about. Nina said she felt cheated out of growing up with a sibling, that she'd always wanted an older brother. Claire said she kept seeing Dad's face in Ethan's features, that it made everything feel more real. That night, I called David and told him about the meeting. I described how Ethan looked, how he acted, the conversations we'd had. David was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he asked if Ethan had seemed okay, if he'd appeared happy and healthy. I said yes. Vanessa had done a good job raising him, but that didn't excuse David's absence. David said he knew that he'd lived with the guilt of his choice every day for 18 years. I told him the guilt was his to carry, that I wasn't going to absolve him of it. Over the next few weeks, Claire and Nina texted with Ethan regularly. They shared music recommendations, memes, and stories about their lives. They made plans to meet up again, and I could see them building a tentative relationship. Meanwhile, David and I met with a marriage counselor to figure out if we could repair what he'd broken. The counselor, Dr. Reeves, asked me what I needed from David to move forward. I said I needed him to be completely honest about everything, to answer any question I had, to give me access to every account and every part of his life. No more secrets, no more compartmentalization. David agreed without hesitation. Dr. Reeves asked David why he'd lied for so long, what had kept him from telling me the truth. David struggled to articulate it at first, then finally said he'd been afraid. Afraid I'd leave him, afraid our daughters would lose respect for him, afraid of disrupting the life we'd built. He said he'd made a cowardly choice at 30 years old and had compounded it every year by not coming clean. The counseling helped us communicate without fighting, but it didn't erase my hurt or rebuild my trust. I told David I needed time, that I couldn't promise I'd forgive him, or that our marriage would survive. He said he understood, that he'd wait as long as it took. 2 months after discovering David's secret, Claire came home from college for fall break. She asked if we could visit Ethan, just the 3 of us again without the weight of David's presence. We drove to meet him at a mall food court and spent an afternoon talking. Ethan told us about his classes, his roommate, his adjustment to college life. Claire talked about her own college experience, and Nina shared high school stories. I watched them finding their rhythm as siblings and felt grateful they'd connected despite the circumstances. At one point, Ethan asked me directly if I was angry at Vanessa. I considered the question carefully. I said no, I wasn't angry at her. She'd been a single mother doing her best, accepting help that David offered, trying to navigate a complicated situation. My anger was reserved for David, who'd had a choice and had chosen dishonesty. Ethan nodded and said his mom had always spoken respectfully about David, had never badmouthed him to Ethan even though she probably had the right to. She'd taught Ethan that sometimes adults made difficult choices and that it wasn't a child's place to judge their parents' relationships. I asked Ethan if he wanted a relationship with David now that everything was out in the open. Ethan hesitated, then said he didn't know. He'd spent 18 years with David as an absent father, someone who sent money but didn't show up. He wasn't sure he could suddenly shift to having David actively involved in his life. Wasn't sure he wanted to. He said maybe someday, but not right now. He needed to process everything and figure out what he needed. I told him that was completely fair, that he didn't owe David anything, that David's guilt and regret were not Ethan's responsibility to fix. Claire agreed, saying their dad had made his choice and had to live with the consequences. Nina added that if Ethan ever did want to connect with their dad, they'd support him, but he shouldn't feel pressured. 3 months after everything exploded, David and I were still separated. He'd moved into a small apartment and we split time with Nina according to a schedule we'd worked out. Claire was back at college but called regularly to check on both of us. The girls had become close with Ethan, getting together every few weeks, folding him into their lives naturally. David asked repeatedly if I'd made any decisions about our marriage. I told him I was still processing, still deciding if I could rebuild trust with someone who'd lied to me for 18 years. Dr. Reeves suggested we focus on rebuilding friendship before trying to repair the marriage. That trust had to be earned back slowly. Then something shifted. Nina came home one day and said she'd invited Ethan to Thanksgiving dinner. She said it was our first Thanksgiving knowing about him, and it felt wrong not to include him. Claire agreed when I called her, said Ethan was their brother, and should be part of family holidays if he wanted. I asked if they'd talked to Ethan about it, and Nina said yes. He'd said he'd think about it. A week later, Ethan called me directly. He said he appreciated the invitation, but wanted to check if I was actually okay with it, if it wasn't just the girls' idea. I told him honestly that it would be complicated having him there, a living reminder of David's betrayal, but that he wasn't responsible for his father's choices. If he wanted to be part of our family holidays, he was welcome. Ethan said he'd come, but he'd bring Vanessa because she shouldn't be alone on Thanksgiving. I agreed without hesitation. Vanessa had been nothing but gracious through this entire nightmare. Thanksgiving arrived and I cooked dinner while Nina helped. David asked if he should stay away since Ethan was coming, and I said he could come if he wanted, but he needed to understand this wasn't about him. This was about the kids building relationships. David showed up an hour before dinner with flowers and an apology on his face. Vanessa and Ethan arrived shortly after. The atmosphere was tense at first. David and Vanessa in the same room for the first time in over a decade. All of us navigating this new family configuration. But the girls pulled everyone together. Claire made jokes, Nina kept conversation flowing, and gradually the tension eased. We sat down to dinner and I looked around the table at this strange assembled family. David at one end, me at the other, our 2 daughters, David's secret son, and the woman who'd raised him. It should have felt wrong or forced, but somehow it didn't. It felt like the beginning of something honest. After dinner, David asked if he could talk to Ethan privately. They went out to the back porch and talked for 30 minutes while the rest of us cleaned up. When they came back in, both looked emotional but not upset. Later, Ethan told me David had apologized, had admitted he'd failed him, had asked if there was any way to build a relationship now. Ethan said he'd told David he wasn't ready to forgive him yet, maybe wouldn't ever be, but he was willing to see if they could start over. Not as father and son immediately, but as 2 people getting to know each other. That was more than David deserved, but exactly the kind of grace Vanessa had taught her son. Over the following months, David and Ethan met occasionally for coffee or lunch. Awkward conversations that slowly became less painful. Ethan introduced David to his girlfriend, showed him around his college campus, allowed David small glimpses into his life. David knew he was earning back trust that shouldn't have had to be earned, that he'd created this situation through his own cowardice. Meanwhile, my marriage to David remained in limbo. We were cordial, cooperative about Nina's schedule, but not intimate or warm. I still didn't know if I could forgive him. Dr. Reeves said there was no timeline for that decision, that I should give myself permission to feel whatever I felt. 6 months after discovering David's secret, I told him I wanted to try living together again. Not because I'd forgiven him, but because I wanted to see if we could rebuild something. David moved back home and we established new boundaries. Complete financial transparency, regular check-ins about feelings, no assumptions that things were back to normal. We were starting over in many ways, learning to trust each other again from scratch. Ethan became a regular presence in our lives. He came to Nina's soccer games, met us for dinners, joined family gatherings. He and David's relationship progressed slowly, carefully, both of them navigating the complicated emotions of a parent-child bond that had started 18 years too late. One evening, a year after everything came to light, Ethan was at our house for dinner. Afterward, we all sat in the living room talking, and Ethan said something that stuck with me. He said he used to resent not having a father, used to wonder why he wasn't worth David's time. But watching our family this past year, seeing the work everyone was putting into healing and connection, he'd realized his worth had never been the question. David's fear and cowardice had been the problem, and those were David's failings, not Ethan's. Claire, who'd come home for the weekend, said she was proud of her brother for understanding that. Nina agreed, saying Ethan had taught them all something about grace and forgiveness. David, sitting in his usual chair, looked at his 3 children and said he didn't deserve any of them, but he was grateful they were giving him a chance to do better. Vanessa, who'd been invited to dinner, said something I'll never forget. She said families weren't just about biology or legal bonds. They were about people choosing each other despite complications. Everyone in this room had chosen to build something new instead of letting David's mistakes destroy all possibility of connection. That's what made them a family. Not DNA or marriage certificates, but the decision to show up and do the hard work. I looked at David across the room and realized I'd made a choice too. I'd chosen to try rebuilding our marriage, not because the betrayal didn't matter, but because I believed people could change and grow. David had 18 years of lies behind him, but he had the rest of his life to be honest. Whether our marriage survived long-term, I didn't know. But I knew we were both trying, both doing the work, both committed to the family we'd created, including the son who'd been hidden for too long. 2 years after finding those bank statements, life had settled into a new normal. Ethan was part of our family, connected to his sisters and cautiously building a relationship with David. My marriage was stronger in some ways than before, built on brutal honesty instead of comfortable lies. I'd never forget the betrayal, but I'd learned to live with it, to see it as part of our history rather than the defining feature of our relationship. And sometimes late at night when David was asleep beside me, I'd think about that drawer full of bank statements, and how one afternoon of looking for tax documents had changed everything. How a secret kept for 18 years had been exposed in minutes, and how that explosion had ultimately brought hidden truths into light where they could be dealt with honestly. The pain had been necessary to reach something better, something real. That's what I told myself, and most days, I believed it. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.